The Catholic Church never banned the tritone, this musical interval. Nobody thought that it would summon the devil. In fact, in this 13th century French Christmas song, you can very clearly hear a tritone in the second measure between E and B flat. The tune is called Vivant Omnes, and it was written by French composer Pérotin at the Notre Dame Cathedral, which, let me check, is, yes, it is in fact a Catholic church, and that is a tritone.
This interval was called the Diabolus in Musica, which
so there was
means
this
the devil
chord that was banned in the Middle Ages by the Catholic Church.
This myth just won't die. It is one of the longest running myths in music theory, and it's kind of part of contemporary internet music culture.
You could have just summoned a freaking demon.
You got your memes, you got your TikToks, you got Jacob Collier repeating this myth on his music theory interview that he did for Wired.
So all people could say was, this must be Satan. This is the devil speaking through music.
Today, I want to go deep, so that this video is not just one long actually, and explore just how this myth came to be, why today we think of it as the devil in music, and why 1,000 years ago they didn't. Let's get into it. This video was brought to you by CuriosityStream and my streaming service Nebula, where you can watch a companion video to this one.
In jazz, we like dissonance, and it's really interesting. Devil, 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 devil.
Yes, yes, Jacob, summon me through the power of jazz and the tritone. It is through that sound I draw my power, my corrupting influence over mortal man. Behold, a harmony most unjust.
Oh, God. Ugh, devil needs some water. Part 1. Tritones, baby. This bad boy right here is a monochord. Invented in ancient Sumeria, it's a device used for measuring musical notes based on dividing a string into equal proportions. I don't have a monochord, but I got one better. I got a bass guitar. So if we take a string and we divide it into 9 equal sections, we're gonna find a whole step or a tone at the first of the 9 divisions. This is the note A. We can do that again, measuring up from A to find another tone or whole step. We can do that a third time to find the third tone, the tritone. We call that an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth today. It's the note that's in between 2 perfect consonances, the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth. And historically, that's been considered hard to sing. In 335 BC, the Greek theorist Aristoxenus said that the melodic distances of a fourth and fifth should never be altered, otherwise they might sound out of tune. Likewise, in the 2nd century AD, Cleonidas calls the melodic distance of a tritone a diaphony, or 2 notes which don't blend together. One theory that might explain the origin of the phrase Diabolus in Musica comes from looking at the roots of the ancient Greek word diabolos itself. Dia, meaning through, and bolos, to throw or to separate. 2 notes which are thrown apart. So diabolos might relate to the word diaphony, which means the separation of pitches, which is an early word for dissonance. And in the Middle Ages, the tritone was definitely considered a dissonance. In A History of Consonance and Dissonance, James Tenney catalogs 30 separate musical treatises from the 9th century to the 16th century in Europe, and they all categorize the tritone as a dissonance. Arabic texts from the same time, like the Kitab al-Musica al-Kabir, similarly appeal to Greek music theory, and they also call a tritone a dissonance. But in all of these textbooks going back thousands of years, there is simply no mention of the devil, the satanic, or the occult. And believe me, people have tried to find it to no avail. The tritone simply was considered a dissonance like any other.
Spare your lies. You know as well as I do that the tritone was especially to be avoided, for it might summon me.
Well, okay, true, fine. People did especially avoid the tritone, but not because they thought it would summon the devil, they just thought it was hard to sing. You can hear that in examples of contemporary music, like Even Flow by Pearl Jam, for example. Listen to the verse melody. The verse melody goes back and forth between F sharp and C, a descending melodic tritone, the 3rd and the flat 7 in the key of D. That jump is difficult to nail perfectly. You can kind of hear how waffly the pitch is on the low C. Now, no shade on Eddie Vedder. If we auto-tune this like contemporary music production might, we would lose all the rich characteristics of the melody. But that doesn't change the fact that that might be hard to sing. Part 2, the Carolingian Super Ultra Hyper Mega Meta Dorian scale. What? What? Oh, it's so stupid.
At a time, the tritone was seen as being of the devil by Catholics and was banned. Wild to think that in the 9th century, the tritone was banned. So apparently the tritone interval was once banned in the church because it referenced the devil.
Now, music in the medieval church started out as chant, plain chant. Sometimes you may have heard of it as Gregorian chant. You know the sound, it's the sound from the Halo soundtrack. Yeah, that thing. Sometimes harmony was added, which was a practice called organum, where monks would sing the same melody down a perfect fourth and perfect fifth, all in parallel fifths and fourths. For what it's worth, this is the Halo theme if it was sung in organum. Sounds pretty sick. There's a problem with this though that Carolingian monks noticed when trying to harmonize this way. The 9th century music treatise and Harry Potter spell, Musica
Musica
notes that the sounds at the interval of a fourth do not all, without exception, produce consonances throughout the whole series of tones. So what does that mean? So the monks would go and try and harmonize using what we would call the major scale today, but they ran across this interval which just didn't seem to work as well. It seemed to pull itself apart. And to explain why that might be,
I'm afraid we need to use math.
let's go back to the monochord. Acoustically, what's happening when we divide the string into 9 equal segments is that A is vibrating 9 times for every 8 times G is vibrating, the open string. It has a 9 to 8 ratio. The same follows for the note B. B has a 9 to 8 ratio back to A, which in turn has a 9 to 8 ratio back to G. The same thing for the tritones. C sharp has a 9 to 8 ratio back to B, has a 9 to 8 ratio back to A, has a 9 to 8 ratio back to G, which ends up being a very complicated acoustic relationship. C sharp vibrates 729 times for every 512 times G vibrates. You end up with this acoustic relationship which is complicated and might sound like a dissonance, a rough sound, a sound which doesn't harmonize well. Now, that doesn't mean you can't harmonize with tritones.
If you wanna run away with me, I know a galaxy and I can take you for a ride.
But probably because of this acoustic relationship, it's a lot harder to. So if you just take the scale as is, you'll eventually run into the tritone, an interval which has that complicated acoustic relationship, which sounds more separated than something like a perfect fourth, which sounds a lot more rested.
There are 12 half steps in an octave. In the medieval times, playing 2 notes that were 6 half steps apart, flatted fifth or a tritone, was known as the devil's interval and banned in parts of Europe.
One solution offered by the Musica is sometimes called the Daseian scale. The Daseian scale is built from 4 tetrachords which go whole step, half step, whole step. The first tetrachord is called the graves, and then that pattern repeats up again a perfect fifth, giving you the finales. This repeats again up a fifth to give you the superiores, and then again to give you the excelentes. There are also 2 leftover notes on top, aptly named the remanentes. This gives you an 18-note scale which doesn't repeat at the octave. So in certain registers, like the graves, you might sing a B flat, but in other registers, like the superiores, you might sing a B natural, which is a little odd. But the result of this is that you can harmonize in perfect fifths all the way up and down the scale without ever hitting a tritone. So it's a little unclear as to whether or not the monks actually thought in terms of this Daseian scale, or whether or not it was just some kind of theoretical concept. But what's really interesting is you can draw comparisons between it and Jacob Collier's super ultra hyper mega metalydian scale.
You rise like do 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 do. You know?
Yeah.
Both it and the Daseian scale are scales that do not repeat at the octave and instead are built on stacked tetrachords at the perfect fifth. The main difference, of course, is that the Daseian scale is over 1,000 years old. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it has been said, see, this is new? It has already been done in the ages before us.
You see? You quote scripture at me, but that just proves my point. They avoided the tritone because they knew its power.
You know, in the Middle Ages, the tritone was identified as the music of the devil.
But the church actually banned composers from using tritones in the Middle Ages.
Church, in hundreds of years ago, forbid this interval.
The devil's note. Like in the old days, you weren't allowed to use that note.
In the old days, you weren't allowed to use that note.
Part 3, the old days, when you weren't allowed to use that note. 12th century France saw rapid urbanization, which brought with it the rise of the great cathedrals. Like, of course, the Notre Dame Cathedral, consecrated in Paris in May of 1182. And like in any period of relative economic stability, People like to get down. The song Topsy-Turvy from Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame depicts the French medieval tradition of the Feast of Fools, a ruckus celebration where ecclesiastical tradition was thrown out the window. This was usually held during the Feast of the Circumcision, and people liked to get drunk. Upon seeing the bacchanal degeneracy taking place in the new Cathedral of Notre Dame, the papal legate Pierre de Capuano got pissed and wrote back to the Vatican of how many egregious and flagrant acts were committed, frequently defiled not only by foul language, but even by bloodshed. Later accounts of the Parisian Feast of Fools told of how asses were led into the pulpit and sausages were consumed on the altar, among other pernicious acts.
Get your sausages here. Who wants to commit some blasphemy?
To stem the tide of this degeneracy, in 1198, the Parisian bishop commissioned new music for the Christmas masses. The hope was that this would get the sausage-consuming masses more jazzed about the power of Christ.
This music's pretty good.
Vivrant Omnes, the tune from the beginning of this video, was one of the pieces of music commissioned by the Catholic Church, in this case for the Christmas masses. It's an example of 4-part organum. You got 4 voices going at the same time, and there's some pretty cool musical characteristics at play. Like, for example, the tenor voice, the held voice, stretches out each syllable of the text extremely long, so it kind of almost sounds like a drone. Each syllable keeps going on for a very long time, so there's a huge shift in color when the voices finally go on to the next syllable in the word. The other voices then would sing short repetitive rhythms based on classic Greek poetic meter. These are what were called the rhythmic modes. And organizing music this way creates a very bouncy, vibrant feel, at least compared to the earlier plain chant, which was more austere and contemplative. At the ends of phrases where syllables finally change, the voices come together in a moment of what's called accented dissonance, which is later resolved. This gives us some vertical sonorities which sound pretty spicy, honestly. Check this one out. Dang, that's spicy. There's also this one. Whew, that's pretty hip, pretty modern. You could make some like 13th century lo-fi out of that one. Music that was being made at Notre Dame in this period, the so-called Notre Dame School of Polyphony, ended up being very popular. And eventually, composers started experimenting with new modes and new rhythms and new techniques in a style that would eventually become the Ars Nova, the new art, to contrast with the previous Ars Antiqua, the old art, the style that was based on plain chant and organum. Some of these experiments in the new art proved pretty weird. Like, this stuff was really strange. Check out this madrigal from Guillaume de Machaut. This tune straight up starts with the melodic tritone, the supposed devil in music. Listen to how delicate it is. It also has a very strange use of harmony and dissonance, which might have been influenced by the actual physical spaces that this music was being performed in. Dissonant passages were intentionally written higher and with less voices, compared to strong, low, consonant stacks of intervals that would reverberate with sympathetic vibrations in the cavernous churches, hopefully invoking the power of God. One of Machaut's masterworks was his Notre Dame Mass of 1365. Check out the ensemble organum singing it. It sounds so beautiful. That added ornamentation, which likely was from Moorish influence, just makes the whole polyphony sound so rich. Especially this passage. Check this one out. What the heck is that? Like, wow, that's spicy. Like, what would you even call that? chord. You wouldn't call it a chord. Like that's something. That's something. Woo.
Don't forget though that this new music, this Ars Nova, was my idea. I corrupted the composers and convinced them to write licentious music to corrupt the souls of man.
So yeah, the church started becoming very suspicious of these new composers with their Ars Nova and started pushing back. In 1325, an official papal bull was declared denouncing the Ars Nova. It's a document, as well as Harry Potter spell, known as the Docta Sanctorum Patrum.
Docta Sanctorum Patrum!
For they sunder the melodies with hockets, loosen them with descants, trample them sometimes with three-part polyphonies and motets in the vernacular. They despise the fundamentals. Kids these days with their Ars Nova, am I right? They fill their ears with impertinence, and they relieve them not. They imitate with gestures that which they have mustered, by which gestures devotion that is to be desired is condemned, and lasciviousness that is to be shunned is made manifest. Now the tritone is not mentioned anywhere here, so this document maybe isn't the best example of the tritone being banned by the Catholic Church, but there is an interesting phrase here. Lasciviousness that is to be shunned. Maybe the tritone didn't conjure images of the devil and the occult. Maybe the tritone was just too sexy for the church. After all, there's this long-standing belief in Europe that music can influence the base emotions, and that can be dangerous.
Demonic chords? Oh, that was way back in the Renaissance music when the church banned the use of the augmented fourth tritone.
Part 4, the fascination of evil thoughts. There was this ancient Greek idea of modal affectations and how different modes might influence different emotions. Some of them make men sad and grave, like the so-called Mixolydian. Kind of like my ex. Others enfeeble the mind, like the relaxed modes. Another, again, produces a moderate or settled temper, which appears to be the peculiar effect of the Dorian, and the Phrygian inspires enthusiasm. The feeling that music had a deep sway over emotion continued throughout the Middle Ages. Improper music might drive people to lustful and licentious madness.
The perfect tritone, aka the devil's interval, once banned by the church but ever present in the minor 7th chord anyway. Can't stop the tritone. Tritone was literally banned for a period of time in the Catholic Church because they associated its dissonance with Satanism. Fascinating the effect music can have on people for real.
In Guido d'Arezzo's 1099 treatise and Harry Potter spell, Micrologus, he writes, one would be so inflamed to a fleshy lust through the sweetness of zither playing that he wishes to break into the chamber of a maiden. But soon, when the zither changes its sensual manner, then driven by contrition, he is ashamed of himself.
Music is one of the fairest and most glorious gifts of God, to which Satan is a bitter enemy, for it removes from the heart the weight of sorrow and the fascination of evil thoughts.
Foolish Martin Luther, you think that you can stop me? I have at my arsenal certain modes that will corrupt even the purest among you.
Here's the thing though, in the Middle Ages, there isn't any mention of any specific mode or interval that might drive this madness. The treatises don't really have any ethical or pathological descriptions of dissonances and tritones and things like that. Instead, the descriptions seem more physiological. The nature of a tritone as a dissonance is hostile to nature and is annoying and irritating to human hearing. Tritones are bad in the same way that getting hit in the head is bad. It hurts. They don't summon the devil. No, they just kind of suck to listen to.
If you wanna run away with me, I know a galaxy and I can take you for a ride.
In 1555, Niccolo Vincentino seems to be the first person to say anything about the affect of the tritone, how it feels and what it does. Vincentino says that the tritone is, quote, vivacious and forceful in ascent, and funereal and sad and descent. The theme to The Simpsons features an ascending melodic tritone, and it seems to have the same affect that Vincentino described almost 500 years earlier. It is vivacious and forceful. There is no, like, devilishness coming through at all here. Maria from West Side Story also features a very vivacious and forceful ascending melodic tritone. It's a yearning melody. There's a lot of hope there. There's a lot of joy in it. The motif used in the intro themes to WandaVision play on this trope of the vivacious, fun and exciting use of the ascending melodic tritone. The context of the tritone and these modern examples seems to be more along the lines of how Vincentino was thinking of using tritones in his music. Less as a devilish invocation and more something triumphant. And so we might imagine a different history where we're not teaching the tritone as the devil in music, but instead we're teaching it as the vivacious in music. It's the playful interval. But instead, today, we have a very different shared cultural connection to the sound. It's this. Part 5, Diabolus in Musica. Black Sabbath, by the band Black Sabbath, has all the accoutrements of the occult. Lyrics, the visual language, everything screams Diabolus in Musica. The guitar riff makes heavy use of a descending tritone from F sharp to C in a context that sounds funereal and sad and desolate. What's interesting here, though, is exactly where Black Sabbath got the idea for this musical language of the tritone.
I was a medium-sized fan of Holt's The Planet Suite, particularly Mars.
Mars, Bringer of War is the first movement of Gustav Holst's The Planets Suite. It's based around a thunderous, crashing tritone. Its musical context is more like warlike and violent rather than devilish, but you know, it's the right vibe for metal.
We were rehearsing and I was trying to play Mars, and then the next day, Tony went in and went, and that's the way how Black Sabbath came about.
Metal musicians very often point to this song and its use of the tritone as being the birth of heavy metal music.
Black Sabbath, their title song, you know, Black Sabbath is totally working the diminished fifth.
The song Black Sabbath has that flatted fifth.
Metal musicians also tend to have the habit of spreading the myth that the tritone was banned in the Middle Ages because, as filmmaker Sam Dunn explains in Metal: A Headbanger's Journey,
there's an ongoing battle in heavy metal to be more evil than the band that came before you.
Any piece of occult lore from history eventually gets wrapped up and assimilated into the branding of metal music, at least in an attempt to sound more evil than the last band. If there's something from history called the devil in music, Diabolus in Musica, of course it's gonna be part of metal music. Why wouldn't it be? But the problem is that the phrase Diabolus in Musica, the devil in music, as we've seen, never occurs in the Middle Ages. The church never banned it. Where is this coming from?
Tritone augmented fourth was banned in churches in the Middle Ages, thought to be demonic.
The very first example of the tritone being referred to as the devil in music, Diabolus in Musica, comes in 1725 in Gradus ad Parnassum, a music treatise by Johann. The phrase is Mi contra fa est Diabolus in Musica. Me against fa is the devil in music. If we were to take our modern understanding of mi and fa, that doesn't really make sense because mi is the third degree of the scale and fa is the fourth degree of the scale. If we play them both together, that's a minor second, which is a dissonance, but not a tritone. So where are we getting this? The tritone is the devil in music business. On the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, there was a system of using hexachords, 6-note groupings which followed the pattern whole step, half step, whole step, whole step. Going from fa, the fourth degree, in one of the commonly used hexachords, to mi in another hexachord might result in a tritone, which is hard to sing. It's a devil of a thing to sing. Within this hexachord system, there was the practice of musica ficta, where singers would slightly alter melodies with chromaticism in order to avoid the tritone, to avoid mi contra fa. I really recommend watching Early Music Source's video on Solmization and the Guidonian hand if you're at all interested in learning more about this hexachord system. It's a fantastic channel. I learn a lot when watching it. Anyway, this technical rule, mi against fa, is the source of all of the devil imagery, which is really funny because the phrase could have just as easily been, man, tritones are just a pain to sing. And then 300 years later, tritones represent pain and agony in music.
Fun fact, the tritone was known in the Christian faith as Diabolus in Musica and was banned from services.
The metaphor somehow changed into a literal interpretation of the phrase Diabolus in Musica. 19th century composers who are familiar with this phrase, Diabolus in Musica, couldn't resist the opportunity to take this imagery and write music around a tritone as kind of like an in-joke that also served to evoke powerful emotions. It's through this process the tritones became a marker of death and destruction, like in Camille Saint-Saëns's Danse Macabre. It sounds aggressive to me, and especially when you name the piece of music Danse Macabre, you're gonna make that connection between the tritone and death. Gustav Holst was well aware of this meaning of the tritone when he wrote Mars, Bringer of War. This is of course the inflection point when it comes to metal music and metal musicians' understanding of Diabolus in Musica.
During like 16th, 17th century, the Vatican outlawed it because they called it the movement of the devil.
Because the imagery is powerful, it is just irresistible not to take it literally, especially if you're in an arms race against your fellow metalheads. Creating an imagined past where the tritone is banned by the church in an attempt to sound subversive in the present. The more that you say that the tritone was banned in the past, the more it seems that you're going against convention now, even if that past never happened and was largely an invention of 19th century composers playing off of a technical rule that they learned when they were first composing. And so that 19th century aesthetic of the demonic tritone is repeated in the 20th century and the 21st century. And the past understanding of the tritone is largely forgotten.
Literally 3 notes, the devil's tritone, once banned by the church.
Part 6, Xerox of a Xerox. All right, to recap, this is how we got here today. 1, early medieval singers didn't like singing tritones, so they invented the Daseian scale. 2, later 14th Ars Nova composers like Michaud threw a bunch of tritones here and there anyway, just because they sounded cool, but most people still avoided them. 3, a cutesy saying about how the sound is a pain to sing is coined probably in the 18th century. 4, 19th century composers wrote music that was based on a cheeky literal reading of the saying and high drama ensues. 5, metal music was born very directly from this 19th century retelling of the cutesy saying Diabolus in Musica. 6, based on metal musicians' desire to seem more evil than the next, we now get the myth that the tritone was banned by the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. You can kind of see how this came about, how our historical understanding of this sound has been like a Xerox of a Xerox. It's been JPEG'd into utter oblivion, and our own understanding of the past is completely unrelated to the experiences of those who lived it. History, in effect, is like this infinite game of telephone. It almost doesn't even matter what interval the devil in music is supposed to be, just that there was an interval that was banned. There was this dissonant interval that everybody was afraid of. It sounds
like a seventh. It sounds terrible. It's actually called The Devil in Music. Quick music theory lesson there for you. But it sounds dissonant. It doesn't sound correct.
So, you know, it doesn't really matter if the church banned the tritone or not in the Middle Ages, because that's what people believe. And if enough people believe it, it becomes the truth. If something just keeps getting repeated over and over again, it bores into people's minds, and that becomes the new way of looking at the world.
Okay, yeah, I know where you're going with this. Yeah, okay, great. Say it.
Repetition legitimizes. Repetition legitimizes. Repetition legitimizes. Repetition legitimizes. Repetition legitimizes. Repetition legitimizes. Repetition legitimizes.
Fine.
Repetition legitimizes. Repetition legitimizes. Repetition legitimizes. Repetition legitimizes.
The opening of Jimi Hendrix's Purple Haze uses a tritone that was banned by the Catholic Church in that era because the sound was perceived
Repetition legitimizes.
Slotted fifth, man. The devil's chord. The devil's interval. And if you lived long enough ago, they'd have hung you for playing that.
Repetition legitimizes.
He shows me a chord progression called the tritone, also known as the devil's interval.
Repetition legitimizes.
The tritone, classified as 6 semitones / 3 tones, is also nicknamed the devil's interval. The Catholic Church was banned for centuries from church music because of
repetition legitimizes.
Viderant omnes, the tritone tune from the beginning, is being taught in Western history classes as homework. So it's not like this is some forbidden ancient knowledge that was forgotten. So I think it's more like the myth is coming from a place where we're wanting to feel superior to people in the past. Like, we're more fully formed human beings who have a better understanding of the world around us, and we aren't superstitious like they were.
I think that in the Middle Ages, people who were ignorant and scared, when they heard something like that and felt that reaction inside their body, went, oh, here comes the devil.
Repetition legitimizes.
The tritone is somewhat famous or infamous among musicians because centuries ago...
Repetition legitimizes.
It seems to me that in popular culture, the general understanding, the general vibe of when Western classical music kind of began is in or around the 18th century or so. This, perhaps not coincidentally, coincides with the Age of Enlightenment in Europe. Since the Enlightenment in the West, science seems to have inexorably marched forward from the benighted past. And so for some people, it must follow that music and art have also been in a constant state of development, getting more and more refined. Since we have technology now that we didn't have before in the past, so too it must follow that we have musical technology that we didn't have before in the past. We know now that tritones are in fact good and cool, and they can be used in jazz music.
In jazz, we like dissonance, and it's really interesting.
So at some point in the primitive past, they must have been bad.
It was such a dissonant sound with no context that all people could say was, this must be Satan. This is the devil speaking through music.
We like dissonant things now, so there must be a higher musical technology at play than the primitive past where people were scared of clashing musical sounds because it might invoke the devil, Diabolus in Musica. Which is, you know, absolutely ridiculous. In that Guillaume de Machaut madrigal, the harmony is very strange. It sounds like nothing that exists in pop music today, and that was the pop music of the time. It sounds like, I don't know, it sounds super cool. It's still the harmony, like, it's very jazz, honestly. Pretty cool. You can hear me talk a lot more about the weird harmony that you hear in this madrigal in the companion piece to this video, which is available exclusively over on Nebula, my streaming service where you can watch a bunch of additional bonus content, not only from this channel, but also from many of your favorite educational content creators like Wendover Productions, Mary Spender, Charles Cornell, Real Engineering, 12Tone, and many, many more. It's a great way to watch and discover quality content ad-free, as well as support your favorite YouTube creators, and also support this channel. You know, the costume budgets and the sausage budgets sometimes are, you know, quite prohibitive here. Nebula is supported by another fantastic streaming service, CuriosityStream, the go-to source on the internet for the very best documentaries with thousands of titles to choose from, including Inside a Virtuoso's Brain, a fascinating look at the neuroscience of musical performance. Now, if you're interested in this, if you click the link in the description or go to curiositystream.com/Adam Neely, you'll not only get some of the amazing documentaries over on CuriosityStream, but also a subscription to Nebula for free. And what's more is that for a limited time, you'll get access to both CuriosityStream and Nebula for just $14.79 a year, a 26% discount, or less than $1.25 a month, which is just an insanely good deal for a subscription service. 2 subscription services, 2 of them. If you click the link in the description, you're not only supporting this channel, but all the other amazing educational content creators over on Nebula, as we build a platform that aims to engage the world in a more meaningful way, and hopefully do things like, you know, debunk the myth that the tritone was banned. Peace.